My name is Michael O'Connor. I'm the chair of the English Reading and Communications Department here at OCC and an associate professor of English. I became involved with Achieving the Dream as a member of the data team about a year ago, and just recently became a member of the core team, the faculty member on the core team this semester.
My name is Julie White. I am Senior Vice President of Student Engagement and Learning Support here at Onondaga Community College, and I'm the Executive Liaison for the Achieving the Dream initiative. So today we want to start by talking about the connection of Achieving the Dream and our initiatives for Achieving the Dream and our strategic plan, which we just launched. So you can see our primary long-term goal for the strategic plan, which focuses on clear academic and career pathways, student-focused services, collaboration, and so on, and with the ultimate goal of increasing our degree and certificate completion rates.
We developed our strategic plan as a long-term goal that we'd eventually reach, and we quickly realized that Achieving the Dream was perhaps one of the best tools we could use to help us reach that long-term plan.
And you can see we've included our short-term goals for the strategic plan and focused on equitable access and research-validated methods, which tie right into our ATD initiatives.
One of the big things that we realized quickly when we started looking into Achieving the Dream was the benefit of pulling our resources together to really address one or two key issues, as opposed to having our resources, efforts, and energies spread diffusely throughout the campus, and making it difficult for us to affect change in a large way.
Yeah, so we decided to key in on two primary initiatives. One has to do with improving our onboarding, advising, and support for students in that critical first year where we found that our students were really stumbling, and related to that, our focus on developmental and gateway courses. Let's talk a little bit about how we came to the decision to focus on those two initiatives and the campus engagement that we had.
Well, it began largely from exploring the data that was there. I was fortunate enough to be a part of that conversation, looking closely at the data. As we looked through the data, one of the things we recognized very quickly was, depending on whether or not our students came in and we placed them directly into college level courses, or if they were placed into developmental courses, their likelihood of graduation changed significantly.
Right. And so we took some of that data and we took it to our community, and we wanted to have full engagement of the campus community. So we did a number of things to try to bring them into those conversations with the data.
And it was a messy process, exciting to listen to everybody. And we decided ultimately, through a long conversation, that the best way to focus on this was to really think about our students in their onboarding process and their engagement with material that first semester, which generally for a high percentage of our students meant their engagement with the gateway courses or their engagement with developmental courses. And we realized that those students weren't oftentimes getting the support that they needed. The more we discussed it and the more we looked at it, we found a variety of different ways of engaging in that first year. One of the big things we found, which struck many people as a surprise, was that our students were oftentimes not necessarily struggling with the academic skills of the classroom, even those who came in less academically prepared. But they were oftentimes struggling with what we've developed. The language we use now is non-cognitive skills, but oftentimes students had trouble figuring out how to navigate the classroom, how to navigate the structure of Onondaga Community College, and how to think about themselves as long-term students.
What's great is we gave them a chance to tell us about that. So we had two events, and this has become, I think, kind of a tradition now, is to have a World Cafe style conversation when we are struggling as a community with an issue. So we invited students to those events. We got to hear directly from them, and for many people, I think that was one of the most valuable parts of those particular events.
Yeah, undoubtedly, to hear students really talk about what was valuable and useful for them We did in addition to having students at the World Cafe events, we also interviewed many of our students throughout the college, which was a really great strategy, because when we just spoke with students who came to the World Cafe events, we would oftentimes unintentionally select for those students who were motivated enough to go to an event like that, whereas when we just took the time to get out and speak with a variety of students as they moved about campus, we didn't just focus on students who were more likely to be successful, and engaged students are more likely to be successful. We also got to hear from students who were struggling.
Right. And the other thing that we did to engage all of our community, we had the World Cafes, we had what we call our trifecta, which was a bringing together of three of our major initiatives on campus: the Achieving the Dream, our strategic planning, and our middle state self-study. So we had to make sure that those initiatives were all working together. So we got folks together to talk about that. We had brown bag sessions on different topics that we were discovering through our data that we needed to learn more about. We have a monthly newsletter. We have a website.
Yeah.
So we tried all different tools of communication for both students, faculty, and staff.
When we first started thinking about the best place to engage with the data that we're focusing on, one of the things we looked at, we did gap analysis. So we tried to look at the different data, and we tried to disaggregate it along a variety of metrics to see which students were performing more strongly than other students. And it began with some recognition that a lot of our students, when they were better prepared for college, they performed better. When students had a higher number of credits, they were more likely to graduate. But as we started really sifting through it, one of the most significant gaps that we noticed was an equity gap. And many of our students, even if we isolated for issues like preparedness for college, and we isolated for economic issues, what we found were underrepresented minority students were performing lower than expectation. They were performing lower than you would imagine. Now, this wasn't a huge surprise for us. I mean, historically, if you look at national data, you'll see that this is the case, but it was really alarming to look at those numbers and recognize that that kind of thing is occurring at your institution, especially an institution that prides itself really on equity.
And those are some of the hard conversations we had through, whether it was through the World Cafes or the brown bags, and really wrapping our brains around that, and then figuring out what was actionable from that data. And as we were having those conversations, as I said, we had other initiatives going on.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about the strategic plan. We also kicked off our Middle States reaccreditation self-study process last year. And that data really informed the key issues that are being addressed by those self-study teams. And the other area that we were working on last year, the SUNY system required us to submit a performance improvement plan. And so we had to say, what were we going to do to increase the number of degrees and certificates that we award? And again, we really relied on that data and those discussions to help us come up with some specific goals so that we could achieve the degree completions that our system is expecting. And
I think it would have been easy to feel overwhelmed when you're looking at these different processes, but one of the real strengths of the approach that we used was to think about the way in which these processes oftentimes speak to each other. And we were most successful when we were thinking in those ways. When we recognize that the strategic plan will have these short-term and long-term goals. The Middle States reaccreditation process is in large part about us supporting that we're reaching those goals, that we're holding ourselves accountable. And the Achieving the Dream initiative was in large part finding the tools available so that we can best reach those goals. So when we thought of these 3 or 4 with the SUNY the SUNY plan, when we thought of these together, they really helped us engage everybody throughout the college who was working on different issues and have us all moving in the same direction and talking the same language with each other.
I think what's been really useful is the conversations that we've brought to our shared governance bodies about each initiative, bringing feedback into the initiatives as we move forward. And over time, people have begun to see how the conversations intertwine. Where when we first started, it felt like separate things happening. And then you can start to have what they call initiative fatigue, right? So too much going on all at the same time. But when we could really weave the strands together to understand these are all interconnected, they are all about how are we going to achieve our goals for student success.
And I think the idea that not only are they mutually informing, so we can hear all people on campus who are working on these differing initiatives, but just as important is the idea that the process was iterative. So we were always getting feedback from these different constituencies, whether it was students, faculty, staff, administration, having all these voices as part of the conversation. We use the term conversation, and I think it's important to think of conversation as in some way aleatory, meaning it changes. There's not always a definitive endpoint on where that conversation is going to go. And when we were at our most successful was when we were really carefully developing our next step and our long-term step from that conversation. And everybody, whether their ideas were ultimately included or not, felt like their voice mattered and the conversation was shaped by everyone's voice.
Yes. And as we've moved into the implementation phase, which is for our second year, we're continuing in that model. And I would say that's by and large a strength, although I also know there are times when we've said, okay, we have to make it's a time for a decision point. We really have spent a lot of time in dialogue, but it's also important to continue to do that. And one of the ways that we've done that moving into our second year was for each of the initiatives that we talked about, we're focusing on the onboarding and first year experience being one, and the developmental education and gateway courses being the second. We've now brought in more people, so more faculty and staff to really help us figure out how are we going to do this.
And I think a clear sense of the goals for those individual conversations help us keep ourselves accountable to that goal. So as you said, it's easy for these conversations to spin off and have various different groups continue to go back and re-question various different policies that we've already focused on. And one of the best ways I think we've found to avoid that, which can be really disabling, is to develop a clear sense of goals for a given conversation. And having people's voices heard and recognizing that what they have to say about an earlier part of the process is still important, but also we need to move forward. So we can always rethink what we've established, but if we're constantly rebuilding our foundation, there's no way the house itself is going to get built. And
that's another way where I think the integration with the other priorities or the other initiatives on campus really helps. Middle States is happening. The peer review process will happen. Our self-study has a hard and fast deadline.
Exactly.
The strategic plan has particular goals. And so the SUNY system has particular expectations of us that people understand are important for our success. So bringing those things together again to remind us all this is not one thing that's happening in isolation. And those dates, those hard and fast deadlines, can then be built into our carefully calibrated ATD plan as well. So for each of these
initiatives, we've developed initial steps, secondary steps, and so on, and carefully planned them out in ways that intersect with the strategic plan and the middle stage review. So I think these deadlines, it's important to hold ourselves accountable.
Because we're also making sure to collaborate with our shared governance bodies in particular, that group works on a deadline basis and on a calendar basis. And so although it's messy, that has provided structure to our work. Because we'll be in the middle of a conversation and we'll say, we actually have to have a decision because we're reporting to our college leadership council, on a coming date. And it's good to have, I think, a tension between kind of that structure and that messiness.
No, I agree, because there's certainly the potential that the process could become overly deliberative. And if we don't hold ourselves accountable to these midterm goals and these short-term goals, then we can spend so much time speaking between different groups that we never actually get moving forward. So recognizing the way in which these different deadlines can be used not so much as a problem or a barrier, but as the impetus to moving forward, I think is a really good strategy.
Right. So we've talked about a few things we might do differently. If we were to give advice to new Achieving the Dream colleges. And one of the things that we talked about, we took some time before we had our initial kickoff. And I think it was October by the time we had our kickoff, and we wanted to make sure we had everyone involved, and we wanted to wait until faculty got back from those who were gone for the summer. But we have determined that it would have helped if we had just done that sooner.
I think it would have given everyone a chance to be part from the beginning, and by the middle of the semester, particularly from a faculty schedule, it's easy to get siloed into your work and to really be focused on what's going on in a classroom, and sometimes it's hard to jump right into that conversation halfway through the semester. And it ended up that first semester, we didn't get as much accomplished as we might have liked.
Right. I think that's very true. And even from a staff perspective, many of the staff who've been very involved in this are in the enrollment and onboarding process, and so the beginning of the semester is tough for them as well. But if we were to do it differently, we would think more about how to use that time over the summer, I think, to have us prepared to launch at the beginning of the semester.
I think one of the other things we would have tried to do a little bit differently is to have a larger faculty voice on the core team. Perhaps what we found after the first year was having a co-chair, a faculty co-chair on that team made sure that all the invested constituents felt like their voice was being fully heard. On a day-to-day basis, a lot, and certainly along the level of curriculum, the success of, I think, an ATD initiative requires real buy-in, not only from administration, not only from staff, not only from support staff, but also really from faculty. And sometimes that can be tough to get. So having a faculty voice on that core team really encourages all faculty to recognize that this initiative is in their best interest as well as everyone. It gets us all on the same page, working together.
I think we found it was really important to have that faculty champion. Yeah, is how I think of it. And speaking of that, in the beginning, there were a lot of questions about what does this mean for me as a faculty? And I don't think we had a clear answer, and I'm not sure how we could have, but perhaps having that more involvement, having that co-chair would have helped us with that.
I think it would have. I do think having that and coupling it with the work we're already doing on campus, I think most of us go into community college because we care about these issues. We choose community college because of the open enrollment, because of access, because of equity issues. These are things we care deeply about. So we're always working on these issues in certain ways in our classrooms. We're rethinking our curriculum for these reasons. So getting that faculty buy-in from the start by recognizing the work you're already doing is in line with the primary goals of Achieving the Dream. We're just figuring out how to best use our resources to change the metric to the largest extent. And getting faculty buy-in on that at the very beginning by having voices heard and by recognizing the initiatives that are already underway and how to think of those within a new structure, I think can be a really useful strategy.
And I think the good news is that it's never too late. We figured that out, and I'm sure we'll have other, challenges that come along the way. But we, I think, have really broad involvement from faculty in our initiatives this year, and our core team and our data team.
Those brown bags that we've held have had a phenomenal amount of faculty involvement. Faculty not only coming out of interest, but also coming to focus to learn more about different things we're doing on campus. We had a developmental education brown bag in which we had a couple of groups from the math department and a couple of groups from the English department talk about the ways in which we're rethinking developmental ed. Some of these had already been ongoing before we started our Achieving the Dream initiatives, but we were able to talk in those small groups about the work we were doing, how it connected with Achieving the Dream, and how the Achieving the Dream initiative helped provide us with the data and the resources, and also the interconnection of the different groups on campus. So there was a real tendency to think in the English department, for instance, that, okay, I'm going to rethink the way we're engaging in developmental composition. We did a big reworking of our developmental composition courses recently. And it's really tempting as a faculty person to focus on just the classroom because that's the stuff that we can control. Perhaps not as much as we like, but that's the stuff that we can control. Whereas we did not think as much about how that relates to registration, how that relates to advisement, how that relates to our student support services. And so the wonderful thing about these brown bags, when we got all these groups together to talk about the initiatives that were underway, those conversations developed organically, and people began to see that all this work was really working together to help our students be more successful, which is our primary goal.
I think that's been a consequence we hadn't foreseen of this work, is a better integration and collaboration between the academic side of the house and the student services side of the house, if you will. We're all working towards the same goals, but we can sometimes be in our own work silo, as you put it, and we've really had to and enjoyed having that kind of collaborative conversation to make things better.
I think that sense of siloing, the sense of really being just cut off from everybody, is a problem that many institutions have. Almost all academic institutions complain about it at some point or another. So what was so interesting is that was one of the things we wanted to work against and try to figure out a way to work beyond it. And the very structure of focusing on achieving the dream the way that we have has allowed us to work a little bit past some of that. And we've begun to develop some of those conversations across groups.
So thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar.
Congratulations on your affiliation with Achieving the Dream. We wish you the most success as you move forward on this exciting journey.
And we welcome you to contact us if you'd like to discuss any of these issues more.
It was incredibly important for us as we began our journey to speak with other colleges that were along the journey already or had just been starting along the same time we were. So I can't encourage you enough to take advantage of that as a resource and speak with us, speak with any other campus you can.
And again, we wish you much luck on what's sure to be a transformative journey.